You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, and the Daily Mirror columnist, Susie Boniface. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The final betrayal, that's how the Mirror describes news that Tata Steel is to shed almost 3,000 jobs at its Port Talbot plant in South Wales, despite getting £500 million in government aid. UK gripped by measles crisis is the lead story in the Mail, which reports that an urgent vaccination programme is needed to ward off a growing wave of measles outbreaks. The Telegraph reports that the Home Office has been quietly granting Channel asylum seekers work permits in care, construction and farming, despite its plan to send many others to Rwanda. The Eye carries a poll suggesting only 23% of respondents believe the government's Rwanda migration policy will discourage small boat crossings in the Channel, while 50% believe it won't. The Times leads with fears expressed by generals that the UK's shrinking army may leave it unable to function as a top-level fighting force. The Guardian reveals that what it calls vital legal protections for the environment and human health are being lost as the government scraps EU legislation following Brexit. The Financial Times reports that the Office for Budget Responsibility is poised to tell the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, that he is in a position to offer tax cuts before the next election. The Express speaks exclusively to assisted dying campaigner Dame Esther Ranson, who makes an impassioned plea for MPs to debate changing the law to make the process easier for patients and families. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Henry Hill and Susie Boniface. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the Mirror and the top story today, those Tata job losses. You take us into this, as it's your paper, Susie.
I wish it was my paper, sadly it's owned by someone else. Shareholders mostly. Yeah, so this is the fact that, as the Mirror's reporting there, that the government has it's been announced on the same day that Tata Steel in Port Talbot is going to shed about a quarter of its jobs, close a couple of furnaces that are making steel within Britain, fresh new steel, using coal, and going to replace it with furnaces which are more carbon friendly and use electricity but can't make the same kind of steel, that make steel from scrap that just isn't as good, and they're going to lose 3,000 jobs. And at the same time, the British government has given them a bung of £500 million. And what it really shows, apart from the fact that a load of that stuff is questionable and problematic and we could argue about it, aside from that, it shows some really poor political nous and messaging within Downing Street that they allowed those two facts to be announced on the same day. Because if you had any sense at all, you would let Tata announce the job losses one day, and on the next day you'd say, we've given them £500 million to protect the rest. Now, what's happened instead is, because they've come out at the same time, all anybody is ever going to remember is £500 million bung and 3,000 job losses. And when Rishi Sunak's been out today giving interviews saying, oh, but with that money, we've saved the other jobs, and without that, blah, blah, it's too late. You know, the fact that the government's given a bung and the jobs have been lost has become part of the mythology of what's happened in South Wales as a result of huge global factors. But it's just been so badly handled by Downing Street. They could and should have just messaged it better. Never mind, actually concentrated on fixing some of these issues rather than worrying about small boats and immigration and other old tripe. This matters more to the people in South Wales, and it's been absolutely mishandled in every possible way.
And Henry, what the government would say is that they've prevented the closure of the entire plant. So actually it is good news. But as Susie says, the unions are saying, number 10, give Tata £500 million to throw 3,000 workers on the scrap heap.
Yeah, I mean, Susie's entirely right that it is abysmal political messaging. You could have staggered it better. I think she's too kind on the government by blaming this entirely on global factors, though. The UK is now going to be, I think, the only one of the world's 20 largest economies that doesn't have the domestic ability to make fresh steel, virgin steel. This is at the same time as we're in a news cycle where politicians are sort of solemnly warning us that we need to be ready for a major war with Russia or another power within sort of 10, 20 years. OK, steel is a key strategic industry. We now don't have it. And a big part of the contributing factor for this is the fact that the UK has uniquely high energy bills because our energy policy has been so badly mismanaged. In other countries, heavy manufacturing like steel is simply more viable because electricity and power is so much cheaper. So actually, and also the government insisted on the bailout package for Tata that the plant itself had to be subject to net zero commitments. Now, that's absurd. I'm a supporter of net zero, but fundamentally we need virgin steel. So all that's going to happen now is we've essentially offshored the carbon. It's going to be manufactured somewhere else and then imported here. But the plant itself will be running these arc furnaces, and so the plant will be cheaper. This is an industrial policy failure on an epic scale.
And it all means that that steel that we need to buy in to build net zero infrastructure, to build cars, to build solar panels, to build nuclear power plants is all going to be more expensive when we have to ship it in from somewhere else.
And create jobs somewhere else.
But even the workers acknowledge that the industry has to be greener and there has to be a transition, though, don't they?
But you can't transition to a clean way of making virgin steel. That technology currently doesn't exist. Net zero is important, and it's important that we find cleaner ways to do things that we can do in cleaner ways, cleaning the grid by moving towards green energy, for example. But making virgin steel requires blast furnaces and requires coking coal. There's simply not a green way of making it. So there isn't a green transition to be made for steel yet. It might be that in the future we come up with a new technology, but at the moment, this is a form of carbon emission that human civilization cannot and will not do without. All that's happened is we no longer have that capacity and those jobs in South Wales.
No, I think what they have said is that, you know, at least if it were staggered, but it's the number of losses in one fell swoop. Let's move on to the Mail, and this measles outbreak, a national incident declared because many people not vaccinated, their children. There is a reticence to do so historically, and really there are going to be consequences.
There already are consequences. There people die as a result of measles infections. In the 1950s, there were maybe sort of 500,000, 750,000 people a year catching measles, and most of those people probably aren't with us anymore. And generations have grown up with the measles vaccine, completely unaware of the damage and the harm and the risk and the terror that it causes. Measles is so contagious that if you walk into a room several hours after someone with measles coughed in it, then you can catch it. It infects 15 people from every one person on average. It causes encephalitis, swelling of the brain. It can cause pneumonia. Even if you get a very light dose of it, as my mother did when she was a girl, you're 3 weeks in bed. No devices, no daylight, no nothing, no television, you know, you're just there with the covers over your eyes. It's really serious, and there's generations that have grown up unaware of that. There's a generation of young adults now who are reaching adulthood who probably weren't vaccinated because of the stupid Andrew Wakefield scare stories in the 90s, and probably may not even be aware that they never had the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. If you catch rubella as an adult, you feel a bit ropey. If you pass it on to a pregnant woman, she's going to have a deformed baby. It really matters. If people aren't aware whether they have an MMR vaccine or not, they need to check. And if you don't have one, or your children don't have one, it needs to be given. And unfortunately, you know, there are lots of public health experts who say, look, you can't force people to have vaccines. It doesn't work. They react badly to it. You've got to coax them and persuade and all the rest of it and hold their hands. And yes, and that's the way that works. And that's what they're trying, but it's not good enough because it's not working, is it? So people are catching it. People are dying today. And I wrote a column about this today. I genuinely believe that anyone who is willfully refusing to let their child get vaccinated without valid medical reasons should be prosecuted for child cruelty, because that's what it is. And it's not just cruelty to your own children, it's to other children who can't get the vaccines because they're immunosuppressed for some reason. It's a dreadful thing to do, to not get the vaccines when they're safe. We've had it for 63 years. There's no earthly reason not to get your children vaccinated.
Well, Britain was declared measles-free by the World Health Organization in 2016. I mean, Henry, do you think that there should be or there should be more public health information, than we should be seeing films about the dangers of measles? Because, as Susie rightly points out, there is a whole generation that's unaware of what this disease can do.
Absolutely, that sounds like a very sensible first step. I mean, the challenge with this as well, it doesn't say so on the front page, but it says so in the story, is that this is a geographically concentrated problem. The West Midlands and London are the two areas where it's biggest, and it's partly the Andrew Wakefield nonsense, but it's also, they say, there's sort of religious and cultural barriers in some communities towards getting the vaccine, and so you need to make sure, I think, that as Britain becomes more diverse, that your public health messaging is actually reaching everyone, because the same messaging won't work for every group or every group of people. And it's not, as Susie says, it's not just about making sure that those children are protected. Vaccination is a shield that depends on mass take-up, because once you get cracks in it and you start getting people contracting the disease seriously, that protection can break down. So this is a really urgent issue that we need to get in front of.
To the eye and migration, only 1 in 5 voters thinks Rishi Sunak will ever send asylum seekers to Rwanda. Surprise?
No. It's kind of astonishing to me that he's put all his political eggs in this basket and is spending all his political capital on it, because surveys have shown that the only people who really hugely care about the Rwanda issue and small boats and so on are about 30% of Conservative voters, which means 2/3 of Tory voters don't care about it as much, don't think it's their #1 priority. It means that the Labour and Lib Dem voters that he needs to try and bring over and build a coalition of, as Boris Johnson did in 2019, they're not having it as their top priority either. And if it's not their top priority, why is it his top priority? And most people, they're fully aware, look, it's not going to work, because the reason people are coming is not because they don't have to go to Rwanda when they get here, you know, and it's not going to stop the fact that they're coming because where they're coming from has got huge economic inequality and climate problems, and that's why they're moving all around the world from and to countries globally. It's not just our problem, and this is not the solution by any means, but he's just put all his eggs in this one basket, which is least likely to be able to hold eggs.
Henry, do you have any insight as to why he's perhaps chosen this as the hill to die on?
I think there's two things that have contributed to this. The first is that the government genuinely thought the Rwanda scheme would be easier to do than it has proven. The original scheme they designed specifically so it would hold up in court. They actually won in the High Court. They then lost in the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court. So they ended up backed into a corner because they'd already sort of put quite a lot on Rwanda, and then they had to overcome the Supreme Court judgment, which means this bill. The other problem is that the Tories, you know, they're behind on economics. There's not that much blue water between them and Labour on a lot of issues. And immigration is one thing where they think that that's a good issue for them in a defensive general election to shore up the Conservative coalition. The problem is they can't talk about legal migration because they've been running one of the most laissez-faire immigration policies in modern British history, and we had a net inflow of 745,000 people last year, which means they can only talk about illegal immigration, and that means that you can only really talk about Rwanda. And the only tactical advantage they get out of this is that it is actually it's a really intractable problem. What do you do about people who are coming here illegally? How do you make the system effective in getting rid of people who shouldn't be here? And Labour do not have an answer. The problem is that the Tory answer isn't very good, but it's at least, they think, better than nothing. But it's not a great position to be in. But if you want to run on immigration and you are importing more people per year than any government in modern British history, small boats is what you've got. And so we're going to keep hearing about Rwanda from now until the election.
Susie, the National Crime Agency is saying this week that the deterrent's the only thing that will work in terms of stopping people coming into this country illegally.
But that's what governments have been saying, I think, the entirety of my adult life. I can remember David Blunkett as Labour Home Secretary going, we need to give them a deterrent impact. I know, we'll stop them working when they get here. It didn't make any marked difference whatsoever.
Well, on that, which takes us to our next story, front page of The Telegraph. Channel migrants have been quietly given the right to work in sectors including care, construction and agriculture and can still retain access to state-subsidised bed and board under a Home Office scheme.
Yeah. So as David Blunkett suggested, that ruled out, stopped that working in 2002, and in one fell swoop made asylum seekers a group of people who could be part of a community and integrate and pay taxes while they're waiting to have their status decided, turn them into a cost to the state that had to be housed and given subsistence payments and so on and so forth, and separated them as well. It made a lot of the problems we've got now. But there was a rule brought in that if it took more than a year to decide your status, then you could be allowed to work. And that seems fair enough, because it takes more than a year just living in a hostel. You need to let someone out and give them some fresh air. And what's happened is, because the problems in our asylum system are so immense and they haven't been processing people, more and more people have gone over that 1 year limit. And so again, this is a fault of Conservative policy and successive Tory Home Secretaries and some Labour ones before to just slow down the process and not deal with the asylum process properly.
Susie, we must leave it there. Sorry, Henry. We get plenty of time after the break. We're going to take a break. Coming up, the Chancellor has apparently been given the green light to offer tax cuts before the next election. We'll discuss that next. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Henry Hill and Susie Boniface. Right, this section, we're going to have a look at the front page of the FT, which suggests that Jeremy Hunt is going to be given the green light on tax cuts, that he wants to share with the population. Take us into this story, Henry.
Yeah, so this basically is the OBR saying that because the cost of borrowing is set to fall, i.e. the cost of servicing the vast amount of government debt, there will be potentially up to £6 to £10 billion worth of so-called headroom for Jeremy Hunt versus the original projections that he had, and that is money, in theory, that the Chancellor can put into cutting taxes before the election. And that's exactly what they're planning to do. We don't know exactly how yet, but the other interesting thing in this story is that Jeremy Hunt has said there might be two fiscal events this year. There's going to be the budget in March, but there may also be one in the autumn, and if there is one in the autumn, that is basically going to be, presumably, immediately pre-election, just a shop window budget. The OBR is a bit of a sort of shadow dance in a way, because the government created £30 billion worth of fiscal headroom by basically shunting £30 billion worth of cuts into 2025-6, which are never going to happen. But because they say they're going to happen and the OBR is obliged to take the government at its word, the government can say, well, we're going to make all those cuts in the future, so we've got some room to make tax cuts now, and the OBR says yes. This looks a little bit more solid in that the cost of borrowing presumably will actually fall, so that will give them some more room, and the government... Taxes are at historic highs, and the problem the government has is that they're trying to scaremonger about Labour's tax policies. But in 1992, when that really worked, taxes were low. Whatever else you thought about the country, taxes were genuinely low. Taxes are now very high, and that means that messaging about Labour isn't cutting through.
Yes, and as you say, Jeremy Hunt open to the possibility of holding a second fiscal event in the autumn that could allow him to cut taxes again if the economy improves. Now, just because of time, we're going to go to rhubarb, because I know you've got an interest, a special interest in this story, Susie. I did not know this, that rhubarb is best when it's picked by candlelight.
Yes. So this is the front page of the Yorkshire Post, which has got this fantastic picture of a chap called Robert Tomlinson, who's picking rhubarb by candlelight in his farm in Pudsey, just outside Leeds, in what is known as the rhubarb triangle, which is a fascinating bit of history. Google it, kids, if you're at home. So... What they do in this part of the world, they have done for a very long time. There's only 10 growers left that do this, and Robert's one of them. But they take rhubarb outside for 2 years, let it grow, leave it alone, bring it into sheds, and then harvest it from Christmas to Easter in the complete darkness when it is sweeter and more beautiful. Amazing. They used to compost it with human waste. It's just fantastic.
She's so enthusiastic.
Fascinating.
She grows her own rhubarb.
Fascinating.